All right, so we're going to work through chapter 24 today. It's just going to be a short and condensed version of ecology. You can use your chapter 24 notes in the biology notebook if you want. You'll notice that I left some parts out, but you can just, feel free to skip around with me if you'd like. Or it may be easier if you want to print the slides so you just know exactly what parts I have included and which parts I haven't. All right, so we're going to talk about what resources populations need to live in a certain environment and what might limit a population in different places. So first of all, in every ecosystem, there are both living and non-living components. The non-living components of the ecosystem are what we would call the abiotic factors. And so abiotic factors are going to determine what plants can grow in a given area. If we had had more time this year, we would have talked about things called biomes, which are controlled by the amount of water or nutrients in the soil, and then the type of plant life. And of course, the type of plant life that grows in an area determines what animal species can live there. And so the abiotic factors that govern plant life are temperature, rainfall, soil nutrients, sunlight, things like that, as well as does the area experience periodic fires? Is there periodic flooding? All of those things are non-living factors that are going to affect what can grow in a certain area. So an area without a lot of rainfall, like a desert, is going to have different plant life than an area that has adequate rainfall and really nutritious soil. So that's why we're going to get different, types of plants in different areas, and then different types of plants are going to contribute to different types of animal life. Just a reminder from earlier in the year that energy is not recycled. So energy is not passed on. Remember, we're going to talk about something called the 10% rule. And so because plants don't absorb like all of light from the sun, and then animals, when they eat plants, they're doing metabolism. And so some of that energy is lost as heat. So the 10% rule that we talked about said that about 10% of one trophic level's energy can be passed on to the next. And so this pyramid here is going to illustrate that pyramid of energy, which also leads to what we would call a pyramid of biomass. So basically the biomass at the top can only be about 10% of the biomass at the bottom. So here at the bottom, we have our primary producers, which would, let's say they represent 20,000 kilocalories of energy. Only 10% of that is going to be passed on to those first consumers, 10% of that to the second consumers, 10% of that to the tertiary consumers, and 10% of that to the quaternary consumers. So this is why we generally tend to see more organisms at the bottom of this pyramid structure than we do at the top. A lot of this energy is lost as waste heat. So you can sort of see if you look here at the lighter markings that some of the energy is being lost as heat. So that 90% that's not passed on, some of it is stored in the organism, of course, and then most of it is lost as heat. So now we're going to talk about ecological relationships, which basically means if two things live in the same ecosystems, what are the possible ways in which they can interact? The first and maybe most obvious way for two organisms in an ecosystem to interact is the predator-prey model. And the predator-prey, we're going to use this little plus minus terminology here to talk about whether it's good or bad for an organism. So predator-prey, this is obviously good for one organism and bad for the other. By the way, this picture is hilarious. This was the picture of the year a couple years ago. And the guy who took this picture says that this marmot, he doesn't actually get eaten, if you were worried about him. So, but this is a good illustration of predator-prey, right? We have a coyote and a marmot, and so one of these, the coyote, right, would stand to benefit from this, while the other loses because it gets eaten. And so when organisms relate into each other in this way, whereas one benefits and the other dies, that would be a predator-prey relationship. It's really important to understand this predator-prey graph, and what that does is it shows us that predator and prey are interrelated. So if you look at this, it's not that hard to understand. The number of bunnies goes up in the spring, right? Because bunnies reproduce, more bunnies are born, and then there are lots of bunnies. Yay! Okay, so we have lots of bunnies, but once we have lots of bunnies, what's this going to happen? Well, new foxes were always born. Now that there's lots of bunnies, food is plentiful, the foxes can hunt as many bunnies as they want, and they hunt and the foxes get very fat. Well, as the foxes hunt and hunt and hunt and hunt, what's happening to our level of bunnies? Well, it's getting lower and lower and lower and lower. Now, because our number of foxes has recently grown, the foxes are going to hunt those bunnies until they dip down well below where they're supposed to be. Now, what's going to happen to our foxes as the number of bunnies gets low? Well, only the good fox hunters are able to catch bunnies now, and some of the poorer hunters in the fox group may actually starve and die off, okay? So we get this slightly delayed where whatever happens now that the foxes have died off, well, the bunnies have a little more room to breathe, they can start reproducing again, and the number of bunnies will go up. But you'll notice that the fox is always lagging slightly behind the bunnies, okay? So the bunnies are going up first, and then the fox population follows. That's what we see anytime we have a predator-prey graph. The prey will go up, the predator population will also rise slightly behind that. Then the prey population is going to decrease as they get hunted, and then the predator population will decrease slightly behind that, and so on and so forth. And so these ripples kind of travel through. Another way that species could relate to each other is interspecific competition. Now this is minus if you look down here. This is bad for both species because what they're trying to do is they're trying to fulfill the same role. So basically they have the same housing area, they eat the same type of food, they live in the same areas, but they basically have exactly the same niche, and probably niches that overlap too much. And so they have to either change or they probably will both die. At least one will be extinct, or both of them could even go extinct from this relationship. A good example of this is the bluebird, which we have in North America, and then the European starling, which was introduced from Europe. And what happens is these birds use exactly the same nesting sites. They like to find holes in trees, basically. And so the European starling came in and started forcing the bluebirds out of their homes, and the bluebirds couldn't get enough to eat, couldn't find a place to nest, and so on and so forth. And so the bluebirds were almost pushed to the brink of extinction. Mutualism is the opposite of interspecific competition in that both organisms benefit. So it's plus plus. Both organisms get something from the other. So for example, a butterfly and a butterfly bush. A butterfly comes to the butterfly bush flowers for nectar. It gets the nectar, which serves as its food, and then the butterfly bush in turn is pollinated by the butterfly. That's plus plus. Another example of this would be an anemone and a clownfish. So the anemone protects the clownfish because it has these tentacles that are harmful to most fish. The clownfish are immune to the sting of the anemone, and so the clownfish can live inside and be well protected. You might ask how the anemone benefits. Well, the clownfish swimming into the anemone often draw other fish with them, and the fish that the clownfish bring with them are not immune to the sting of the anemone, and so the anemone can actually eat those fish. And then the clownfish benefits, of course, from protection, and also clownfish eat any leftover food that the anemone does not eat. Parasitism. So parasitism is plus minus. So for the parasite, it's positive because the parasite gets food, but for the host, it's negative. However, it's really important in parasitism that the organism doesn't kill the host. So the host is supposed to be alive and be a source of continued food for the parasite, but it's not supposed to die, or that would turn it into a predator-prey relationship. However, the reproductive success of the host is oftentimes decreased, and eventually the organism could die from parasitism. A tick and a dog are a pretty good example of parasitism, but my absolute favorite example of parasitism is this guy that's down here. This is a deep ocean creature that inspired the movie Alien. This is called a phronema. A phronema is it's a creature that's loosely related to crustaceans, but you can see here it's completely translucent. But what's creepy about them is they find these little barrel-shaped organisms and they kill them. And then they hollow out their insides, and then they lay their eggs inside of this barrel. I know, truly terrifying, right? And they roll the barrel around with them through the ocean. So that's what this one on the end is doing. She's laid her eggs in here. And then she takes this barrel and she basically rolls it in front of her as she travels around and uses the barrel from this dead body of this creature that she's used as a nursery for her eggs. And so when the eggs hatch, they'll basically like rip open the barrel and hop out, which if you know anything about the Alien movies is exactly what happens in that movie. Spoiler alert. This I think is a really great example of parasitism. So eventually this does actually kill the host. So these are called more parasitoids than they are parasites because the host does have to die for this to happen. But because they use the still living body of the organism, it counts as parasitism. Commensalism. This is the rarest of all ecological relationships because in order to have commensalism, one species has to benefit while the other species suffers no positive, like it doesn't have any negative effects, but there are also no benefits. So one species has to be completely unaffected. The best example of commensalism comes from these little fish called the remora fish, which are all these little guys swimming down here. And then sharks. By the way, this is the best animal on the planet, the whale shark. So the whale shark here, what happens is basically the whale shark will catch and eat food. And then any of the leftovers that the shark does not choose to eat, the remora swim around and they eat them up. So the whale shark will only leave behind leftover food that it wasn't going to eat anyway. So it doesn't have a positive or a negative benefit from the fish eating its leftovers, but the remoras positively benefit from the additional food. So that would be an example of commensalism. So in any ecosystem, there are going to be limiting factors. So what that means is an ecosystem can't hold an infinite number of organisms. There are factors that are going to control what we would call the carrying capacity, which is what's the size of a population in a given ecosystem. So there are both biotic and abiotic limiting factors. So biotic would refer to anything living, and then abiotic limiting factors would refer to those non-living factors. So biotic limiting factors, so these are going to be living things that limit a population. A population's predators, the amount of prey that are available to eat in a given season, parasites that the population might suffer from, competitor species that the population has to fight for food, and the amount of plants that provide either food or also nesting sites for them. For example, the number of trees would also be a limiting factor. Abiotic limiting factors are going to be things like, is there enough water to support the population? Are the soil nutrients good enough to allow the types of plants that the species needs to grow? Is the temperature warm enough to support the population? Is the soil deep enough? For example, if it's a burrowing creature, is the soil good for burrowing into and making homes? And so all of those would be examples of abiotic limiting factors. So if you look at this and you think about a prairie dog population in Fort Collins or just anywhere in Colorado, what would be some limiting factors on this prairie dog population? Well, if we want to think about abiotic limiting factors, one might be the amount of space that they have to actually build burrows. Another might be the kind of soil. Is it the right type of soil that they need to be able to make their tunnels? Another one might be weather. Is it warm enough for the prairie dogs to live? If we wanted to think about some biotic limiting factors, predators, right? Are there coyotes or foxes in the area that are going to hunt them? Disease, we might think of like bacterial infections that the prairie dogs could get that might kill them off. Grass, is there enough food for the prairie dogs to survive? Okay, so that would be some examples of limiting factors. Now, when a population grows inside of an ecosystem, there are two possible ways that that population can grow. The first is exponential growth. So this is what we often see when a population first expands into a new area. So there's no limit to population size seen, and the size is going to double at regular intervals. So we're going to get a very steep up. Now, this may be followed by what we would call a crash and a boom and bust cycle. So let's say that a species moves into an area and there's a very abundant food supply that season. The population may begin to grow exponentially, okay? And then here, let's say they run out of food. Now our population is going to crash just as quickly, if not more quickly, as it grew, okay? Now, once we have fewer population numbers, let's say that their food supply returns or something, then they may begin to grow exponentially again and then crash again. This is something called a boom and bust cycle. It's not what we typically want to see, and it's also not what we typically do see in an area, but it can happen in certain conditions. The more typical curve would be what we would call a logistical growth curve, which is where the population experiences a period of exponential growth until it reaches something that we would call the carrying capacity. Now, the carrying capacity I've noted down here is the maximum population that can be sustained by a given ecosystem. Now, this does not mean held. So it's not like how many deer could I possibly pack into that forest if I were trying to squeeze them in shoulder to shoulder. It's how many deer could survive for a season and actually find food and then make it to the next season. So that's what we mean by sustained. So a population could experience an area of exponential growth, and then it may overshoot the carrying capacity just slightly. Now this overshoot means some animals won't be able to find enough food, they will probably die off, and also winters are generally hard on species that live outside. So over the winter, we may actually dip down below our carrying capacity, as some animals don't make it, okay? And then in the spring, well, we're gonna have a cycle of new births, right? So maybe we bump a little over the carrying capacity. Maybe we have a bad year with forest fire or water, drought or something like that. The population could actually remain below the carrying capacity. Then we have a really good year, right? It jumps back over. So what we're going to see in a logistic growth curve is a period of exponential growth that slowly levels off, and then it kind of hangs out somewhere here around the carrying capacity for that ecosystem. And that is all we have to do with chapter 24, which is your last chapter for the year. So congratulations on being done with biology.